What's up, brownies? So this video was inspired by a clip that's going viral from Kirk Franklin's interview with Cam Newton on his podcast. What I'll be focused on is the fact that the church is supposed to be set apart from the world. However, nowadays, when I hear a man with a microphone, I can't tell the difference between when you're on a podcast and in the pulpit. Both the patriarchal societal talking points and those from the church are all talking about men being the leaders and women submitting to men and men being the head of household, regardless of whether they have the head of household money or not. So why is it that when it comes time to place blame and shame in regards to marriage and the state of the family unit, we're not blaming the leaders? Stop giving women instructions on what they need to do and be in order to get and keep a man. The focus needs to be put on men changing their actions. So let's get started.
I believe that marriage has been weaponized in Western Christianity. Sexuality has been weaponized. You living in sin, you need to get married, without realizing that marriage doesn't fix sin. And how we super spiritualize these messages. He that findeth the wife findeth the good thing. Yeah, but Paul also said, I wish that some of you were like me. I wish some of you could be single, because some of you could even be more useful in the kingdom if you were single, Paul said. Now, marriage is a good thing, but Paul said, but marriage is a necessary distraction. I have many friends that were in ministry at church, and the churches told them, if you're going to be in ministry, you can't be single.
Now look at how many pastors got married in their early 20s and have gotten divorces after 10 plus years because they were tired of being in those miserable marriages and they weren't with a woman that they feel like God has made for them. So they're not even sat down when they are going through a divorce or when they are out here dating while they're still in the pulpit. But when they find the women that they say God has made for them and marry them, you have the congregation looking at the women sideways and saying that they have a Jezebel spirit on them and asking if they're holy enough to be a pastor's wife. But you don't have this same type of smoke and questions for the men in the pulpit.
And so what people do, they quickly get married thinking that they're fulfilling God's will for their lives, but they are fulfilling man's dogma.
So let's talk about what catchphrase Christians tend to say in order to pressure people into a marriage and then shame people into staying into that same bad marriage. Number one, it is better to marry than to burn. Number two, God hates divorce. Number three, what God has put together, may no man put asunder. A lot of these boomer and silent generation marriages lasted for 40 to 60 years because they got married so young, like in their teens or their early 20s. So if you want to have sex with a person, just go ahead and marry them. So now you're young and you have made an ill-informed decision. And in order to keep you stuck in that marriage, they're going to tell you that God hates divorce and what God has put together, may no man put asunder. The problem is God didn't put that marriage together. Your hormones did. What this also highlights is how oftentimes men have been pressured into marriage for societal norms or a certain standing in the community, not the fact that they actually wanted to get married. And then you wonder why marriage is so miserable for women and why women initiate divorce 80% of the time.
You know, Tammy and I have had to walk through deep waters because of a lot of the bad beginnings of religious dogma. That's why it is very important for people to understand the fullness of faith.
So for those of you who don't know, both Tammy and Kirk had children in those teenage to early 20s years that I was talking about in that time frame before they got married. Some will focus on the fact that, see, they compounded the sin by out of wedlock sex and then out of wedlock children. It would have been better for them to just marry the people that they were lusting after. Because if you feel that way, then you should consider the fact that they would have been trapped in a fruitless marriage that God did not put together, and that could have prevented them from marrying each other. You know, the church spends an unreasonable amount of time focusing on homosexuality, and you'll kick a gay kid out of your house and excommunicate homosexuals from your church. But could you imagine the improvement that the Black community would see if you did the same thing for Black men who impregnate and abandon their women and the children? But instead, we put so much focus on shaming the girl and outing her for having the baby, but we don't expose these fathers right along with them. Let me give you some proof. Sarah Jakes, everybody talked about her for getting pregnant at 13, but we never did find out who that father was. Why wasn't the father outed and named and shamed right along with her when she had a baby at 14? Niecy Clark is another one. So she's saying, oh no, I wanted to leave the group. I wasn't sat down. Okay, girl. You know, them people talked about you like a dog for having multiple out of wedlock children, at least one of which is supposed to be with a man of the cloth or with a bishop or something. But why weren't the men who were the fathers exposed, and why weren't they sat down if they were men of the cloth or in the church? Aretha Franklin is another example. Had a baby at 12 and then another one at 14. Now they waited until this child was grown to start talking about the fathers. One theory was it was some boy named Donald that she went to school with. And then that story was changed to say that the father was the same. Why was the child that she had at 14 named after that young boy, and that child was his junior, but the first one wasn't? I mean, if you're going to claim a baby that you had at 14, what's the harm in claiming the one that you had at 12, especially if nobody's going to jail for it and being shamed for it, except for Aretha? But she was still allowed to continue to do what she did because her father was a man of the cloth. I don't know who the father of that first child was, but I will say this. Incest is frowned upon from a medical standpoint because when people who have DNA that is too close together have a child together, the child can oftentimes have some deformities and defects. And I also say that Aretha's father got a 12-year-old girl pregnant in their church in Memphis, and that's why he was run out of town. But if people knew about that when he got to Detroit, why was he still allowed to preach? Why wasn't he sat down permanently?
And any woman listening to this can attest in our culture. Don't be no 30, 35-year-old single Black woman and go to the family reunion. All the older women are going to do them. They're going to look at you and wonder and question you and challenge you on what? Why you not married?
Where your man at? Where your kids at?
Like it's a prerequisite for identity and value, that if you don't have a man, if you don't have kids, that something about you is broken. Do you understand how dysfunctional these messages are?
Yeah, I know this is the part that everybody focused in on and what they wanted to talk about. But I want to first start by saying that Kirk is correct when he said that it is the women who are questioned, blamed, and shamed more so than anybody else for not being married and having children by a certain age. That there are all kinds of negative and derogatory names for women: spinster, old maid, leftover. What do you call a man? Oh, well, he's just a bachelor, a player. Something that is more so congratulating men for being able to sleep around and for having different women, but not being tied down and married. We are setting people up to fail from the beginning on both sides. When people are talking about you being single and having multiple women as a man, they are congratulating you. And then you hear men refer to marriage as like the old ball and chain. Why would you think that a man would want to propose and want to get married?
You can be single and be used by God. You can be single and have purpose. Being married is not a prerequisite for God's hand on your life, but we've weaponized it. And then crucify people when those same marriages don't fail.
Cam got excited around that part, didn't it? Because he's using what Kirk is saying as some sort of justification for his life, when what I wanted to hear Kirk say in this interview is the same thing I wanted to hear Iyanla and then Dr. Umar say when they interviewed Nick Cannon, which is this: it is men like Cam and Nick Their lifestyle is actually a part of the problem. It is impossible for you to be a consistently and effectively active and involved father with these many children spread out with these many women over all of these different households instead of them living under the same roof as you. And yet and still, when you talk about these broken families, you are not congratulating women for being the ones who stepped up to the plate and are taking care of the children and not running off like men did, but you're also not putting the blame and the focus on men, the ones that are supposed to be the leaders and the head of household and all of this. You don't put any blame and shame on leaders. With great power is supposed to come great responsibility. With men, with great power comes no responsibility, no accountability. And that's my problem with all of this blaming and shaming of women. We never put that same type of stigma on the leaders, especially if they are so-called men of the cloth. You can have children accusing a man, and they could have at least sat him down until the investigation was over with. But when you are being scrutinized or accused by multiple children, I think that that's something that people need to look into instead of saying that children ought to be seen and not heard. Or what about when a man has to get caught being inappropriate with other women or cheating on his wife 3 times before he's finally sat down? But before then, we're right back to blaming women. And women do this to other women instead of focusing on men all the time. Well, did you know he was married? Did you know that you were sleeping with my husband? Girl, your husband knew that he was married. So let's put the focus on him instead of putting scripture on that strange woman who whispered to a 16-year-old version of him. No, but that man is like 36, 46 years old. He's not a child. The constant infantilization of Black men and coddling of their behavior is disgusting, and it's counterproductive. Just like a man who is able to cheat on his wife multiple times, one of the mothers comes and blasts him out in front of the church. Now he can be sat down or run off, but that's only temporarily because he continued to have more out of wedlock children and more affairs. And this was before, during, and after the divorce. And he's still preaching right now to this day, even after he kept doing the same thing in the interim. Do you see my point about how men are not held accountable by the church or in the church in the same way that women are? I'm not accusing, bashing, or shaming these men. I'm just simply stating a well-documented and publicized series of events that you all already know about for the purposes of an example.